I'm gonna mute myself then. And so, Don, I think
Sure.
we're ready for you if you want to get started. Thank you
All
for.
righty, I'll go ahead and kick it off. So thank you for the opportunity to talk today. This talk is has been very enjoyable for me to build because I've only really been working with kids for, I'm in my third year. I've done some teaching meditation at the detention center, and I've had my first CASA kid, which I found extremely enjoyable. However, uh, I'm sure many of you have also had the experience of when trying to understand your own teenager, perhaps, or your own adolescent. They are a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, and uh, for those of you that are history buffs, you probably know where this came from. The expression is actually Winston Churchill. I think he was describing Adolf Hitler. But I've always kind of liked that expression in terms of complexity. Um, Having worked in medicine, I can tell you that we understand a lot about the brain, but there's an amazing amount that we don't understand. We don't understand the basic sense of how do our brains actually experience reality? What is it that makes us? So as we go through this, my disclaimer is there's a lot of neuroscience that we don't know. And the science around the actual intervention of working with kids is not clear. There's a lot of variation. There are some central themes I'll be providing you today, but if you'll bear with me, I will share with you what I've learned in putting this lecture together. So just real briefly, my background is in three fields. Radiation oncology, that's the use of treating very high dose radiation to treat cancer patients. Medical imaging, so when I talk about fMRI or diffusion tensor imaging, that's all kind of a part of my medical background. And then the last leg of my career, I managed oncology information systems. So I'm a nerd. I will confess to that, but I really like working with people also. Okay, so what's an adolescent? So I don't know if any of you have seen what the adolescents like to post of themselves nowadays, but there are probably 100 different videos that show teenagers hanging from tall buildings with only one hand, climbing to the top, doing the selfies. I was a pretty crazy teenager, but I didn't have the courage or I'm not sure it's courage, but lack of good self-restraint to do anything like this. But I thought this picture kind of identified kind of the stereotype that we have of teenagers and adolescents. I am going to work to try to change your picture of adolescence a little bit. But yes, they do take some amazingly high risks during their life. So the word adolescent first appeared in the 15th century. It's derived from the Latin word adolescere is, I believe, the correct announcement, and that means to grow into maturity. In the early 1900s, the head of the Psychological Association, G. Stanley Hall, very presciently defined it as the ages of 14 to 24. There's no fixed and fast definition of adolescence. Some go when the child hits puberty, or anything from 12 to 14, and then the oldest part of that age I've seen is 25. It's interesting to note that the insurance company was ahead of all the neuroscientists because they have all of the data on young male drivers, and based on that, like for those of you who had to insure yourself at the age of 25, or perhaps a child, that the rates are high because we still, young men of that age, are still not fully responsible behind the wheel. So I wanted to change your perception a little bit of the adolescent. Yes, there are serious differentiations between a child, an adolescent, and a fully mature adult. But these young people are also an amazing source of intelligence and insight. This graph shows Nobel Prize winners and great inventors. I want to draw your attention to kind of where the arrows are. So this is not when they got the Nobel Prize. This is kind of when they were doing work on their Nobel Prize. So kind of starts like 18 to 19 years old and to go up to the 20 age of 25, about 20% of the overall Nobel Prize winners did a huge amount of their work during their young years. So cultivating young people to use the amazing number of neural connections that they have, I think is one of the things that we can do to help our kids. I just gave kind of 4 random examples of people that had done that. Albert Einstein, of course, theory, special and general theory of relativity, Charles Darwin, Marie Curie, and then one of my favorite scientists was Rosalind Franklin, that actually was a major contributor to the discovery of DNA. But please know that a lot of our stereotypes do apply, but this is an amazing group of young people, and they have contributed vastly to what our society is. So let's talk a little bit about just how the adolescent brain is physically different. And I'm going to basically say the ages of 13 to 25. So this is kind of cutting to the chase. What's different is the number of synaptic connections. That's probably the big difference. And then also a piece of that is the increase is that every nerve cell is wrapped in myelin, and I'll talk a little bit about more. And then, of course, the teenage brain is immersed in a great deal of hormones. For us young men, I always jokingly call that testosterone poisoning because we seem to lose our mind, but there are tremendous changes during that time. So, neuroplasticity. Talked a little bit about this during my meditation lecture, but if you look at the image on the right-hand side, it says presynaptic terminal neurotransmitter synapse. Young people have more connections than we do as adults. They're starting to lose some of those connections, but initially they have far more connections. The process of losing those connections happens throughout the adolescent period, but the starting point is they start out with many more. And if you look at that, that's something that we can tap into as CASA volunteers, because if we can help cultivate the child to learn, and it can be really anything. That if they're interested in science, great, but if they're interested in art, music, anything that fascinates them. I recently had a good experience with my CASA kid. He was interested in how to develop clothing using online systems with the full 360 from production to actually selling. And I think I learned more than he did. But if we can get kids interested in learning things, that's going to help maintain and keep some of those very important synaptic connections. So the other thing, and I just learned this a few years ago, is that there is what's called a myelin sheath. Now, we all learned this in high school, but they didn't tell us the important point. And that's that in the axon, the connection from one neuron to another neuron, there is a cell type that's called oligodendrocytes that make up this myelin sheath. And very simplistically, it's kind of like the rubber that coats a wire carrying a signal. So it reduces what we call in engineering the signal to noise ratio. It helps protect it from electrical information from surrounding neurons that are packed so close together, but it really helps maintain the integrity. And then it also creates kind of a secondary sodium ion pump between each of these little bubbles of the myelin. There's a pump that actually recharges the signal and sends it on. What is interesting is that the myelin sheath actually helps to increase the speed of the transmission of a neural signal by hundreds of times. When they did the autopsy on Einstein's brain, they actually found that his myelin sheath around his neurons was that of a 25-year-old. So these myelin sheaths are very important to intelligence. And adolescents have very, very good looking myelin sheaths. So in terms of the development of the adolescent brain, if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, you'll see that the arrows kind of going from the back to the front. That's how the adolescent brain kind of grows. So it starts in the back and then slowly creates the front. The front area is called the frontal lobe, and that's a critical area because that's where judgment, memory, language, emotional expression, problem solving, appropriate sexual behavior all resides in that frontal area. In some ways, it allows us the discipline of self-control. And I'll talk a little bit more about self-control here later. But in looking at the science literature and listening to kind of the psychological aspects, self-control seems to be the pivot point in terms of the teenage brain. And I think that also may serve as a benefit to us in how we connect to our kids. The other piece that happens is once the brain kind of is working on creating the frontal part of the brain, there is a neural circuit that develops between the front part of the brain and the amygdala, or the kind of, you might just think of it as kind of the emotional connections. But that takes a while to develop. I think they were quoting that doesn't really get fully developed until you're in your early 20s. But that has what that provides us with as adults is the ability to focus attention. So in young people, they have a diminished connection, but the good news is that it is their attention ability is forthcoming. Organizing thoughts and problem solving, foreseeing and weighing possible consequences of behavior, which I think is a very important insight. A lot of kids just have no sense of if they do A, B is going to happen. They don't really seem to think it through. Forming strategies and plannings, that's also important too. I'll talk a little bit about how we might help kids by asking them to think about planning. And the planning that I'm suggesting is planning out their next 5 years or next maybe 10 years of how they'd like to change their life. There seems to be some pretty good advantage in teaching kids to plan out their lives and the ability to balance short-term rewards with long-term goals. Typically, the short-term reward is that I'm talking about young men is that they like to climb the tall buildings and they like to do so in front of their own peer group. That seems to be what a key piece is. Typically, adolescents won't do this unless they have their own peer group there seeing what they do. So that seems to be a critical connection. So adolescent behavior ranges. So for me, this next slide is helpful because my medical background, of course, is not psychological. So I wanted just to get a sense of what's kind of normal for a teenager. And again, the science is very fuzzy on this, so please take this with a big grain of salt. So take the first one. Normal teen behaviors, one is spend more time with their peers and less time with families. And if you've had a teenager, we've all seen that. What gets into the area perhaps not normal is not wanting to spend time with either family or friends and shutting all social activity. Reluctance to get up early for school. I'm 65 and I'm still reluctant to get up, but if a teenager absolutely refuses to attend school or doesn't seem to be able to get out of bed or sleeps excessively long, that's an issue. Now, let me first state that what I found in the literature was that teenagers need more sleep. The range is from like 9 to 10 hours per day. Again, that's varies, but if we find a teenager sleeping 12 to 15 hours a day, that's a sign that they may have a secondary issue. They do need more sleep for growth spurts, but again, if it gets to be too long, then that's cause for concern. Sadness and anxiety, teenagers are expressly prone to having strong feelings if they broke up with a boyfriend or girlfriend, and that's pretty normal, but sadness and anxiety that doesn't correct itself within a couple of weeks, that's something that is atypical. So we were all young once, and I'm just going to confess, we all experimented with alcohol, drugs, or dangerous types of behaviors. However, if they get to where they're breaking the law or just consistently breaking the rules of the house, those types of things, that's cause for concern. Turning to a beloved pet for comfort, that's really very normal. Deliberately harming or torturing or killing any animal, that is cause for a concern. Now, in terms of killing an animal, that doesn't, we're not talking about if a boy goes out with his father hunting, that's harming, a pet or something like that. And it's very, teens are very, very concerned about their appearance when they're with their peer group. But if they have, if that changes suddenly and all of a sudden they're not eating or overeating, that is cause for concern also. So I'm going to just pause there for a minute and see if there are some questions, and then we'll go on a little bit more with the science, and as well as some of the possible psychological interventions. So.
Don, this is Judy McDaniel. Can you tell us what the myelin sheath has to do with intelligence?
Yeah, what it does is, I'm trying to figure out, let's say that you have a computer and it's got really bad wiring in it.
Yeah.
The myelin sheath actually would help to correct the signal of that those wires that are carrying the intelligence, and would amazingly speed up the rate at which those signals are sent from one part of the computer to the other part of the computer. So that's kind of it in a metaphor. Does that help, or am I missing the mark on that one?
Well, yeah, it at least gives me some idea of why it makes a difference if they get thinner. And
yeah, absolutely. And as unfortunately as we get older, we start losing our myelin sheath. But
right, and so connections start to go a little haywire then.
Yep.
Okay. All right, that makes sense.
Good, thank you. Other questions? Alrighty, and hearing none, I'll continue. So I put this slide in because I like this. This gal is a neuroscientist. She doesn't look old enough to be a neuroscientist, but perhaps that's a statement of how old I've become. But Andrea Galvane did a great talk about the teenage brain. The piece that I really liked in it, because I didn't know this before, is teenagers are significantly more susceptible to addiction. So what I found interesting was to actually use sugar. I'll confess, I do like my sugar. I think many people do, but if you look at the red bar on the right for teenagers and then the bar that shows adults, I mean, there is a very large increase in how teenagers react to the sugar. That has to do with dopamine and serotonin. So that's just an indication for us, if in terms of trying to guide teenagers, letting them know that if they start smoking now or, God forbid, during illegal drugs, they have a much higher rate of becoming addicted to it long term. So that's a kind of a cautionary tale, if you will. The way that they did this was they actually were able to put teenagers and adults into a diffusion tensor imaging device, and that actually looks at the network side of the brain that they can actually tell how much the brain's networks as well as regions of the brain are actually reacting to the sugar, which it's kind of a measure of the dopamine, I believe, or serotonin. Another very worthy talk to listen to online, and again, I'm just adding these for you folks. If you'd like to listen to these, Sarah Jane Blackmore, she's written a book called Inventing Ourselves. Also a neuroscientist, a lot of great information about the teenage years. One of the best things that I got is we all think of adolescent behavior sometimes as a bit out of control. The magic to anticipating that is they're most out of control when they're with their peer group because they have this high need for acceptance from a group outside of their family. So they're going to act on impulse, which in another way of saying it is not having good self-control. Their emotional intelligence is not yet fully developed, so they can misread or misunderstand social cues and emotions. So they might look at a person and think they're angry, but the person really is just confused about what they say. And of course, they get into accidents. They are more apt to, young men probably more, get involved in fights and engage in dangerous or risky behavior. So I talked about this in terms of listening to the adolescents. So I'm kind of switching here from neuroscience to psychologists. How we study the brain is far different than how we interact with children. And I added Fred Ray LeBrand to this talk because I thought he had some sage advice. I like my advice, very, very simple, something that I can kind of remember in terms of how do I listen to adolescents? My own children have long left the house, and listening is so important to really be able to understand. But there are two thoughts that he gave that I thought would be very helpful. One, that the adolescent is trying to get out, and what that means is they are moving away from parental control, and that's actually okay. I mean, a teenager at some point, is going to go away to college, hopefully graduate, get a job, or go to VOTEC training. They have to have the ability to mature and move away from parental control. That unfortunately gets to be a bit of a tug of war during that process, but that's okay. And then they are, of course, trying to get in, and we all see this with teenagers needing to be part of our peer group. And unfortunately, that's why gangs in the cities work so well, is young teenage kids are looking for something to belong to, and the gang members seem to have a strong intuitive sense of that, and unfortunately capitalize on that. But just kind of hanging on to those two thoughts that kids are trying to get out, mostly the house and parental control, and trying to get in. They're looking for acceptance from their peer group typically. So just kind of sitting back and trying to think about how might we use some of this information to work with our kids. My disclaimer here is at the top that there is significant variation based on professional and personal experience. I bet you if we had 25 psychologists that have worked, 20 years each in terms of how to deal with children, there's certainly going to be some major themes that are part of that dialogue, but they will have a different sense. I kind of found that when I listened to several psychologists talk about how they interact with children. So please take this as not so much scientific, but kind of experiential. One of the things that we can do with especially teens is cultivate self-control. And everything that I've read and listened to, this is the missing piece and the biggest missing piece in teenage years. And if we can help them develop that, that will be helpful. So going back to the neuroplasticity, the more that they practice self-control, the stronger they're going to be at it. So one of the things that we can do is suggest, and I say suggest because you probably don't want to tell a teenager anything, they may rebel from it, but suggest that self-control can be really helpful to them. And then if we see them doing something positive, compliment them based on, their self-control. So for example, if you're working with a teen and they've been getting D's and all of a sudden they get a B in algebra, compliment them, not for getting a B, but for that hard work that they did to get that B. That there seems to be an important piece of not focusing on the outcome, but focusing on hard work, perseverance, and self-control. In terms of listening to teens, many if not all of the teens that we're working with have had very, very difficult lives. It's important to be empathetic and listen well, acknowledge their difficulties, but also acknowledge that they have an opportunity to change their life. Many of them are just thinking, I've had a horrible life, this is just going to continue and I'm never going to get out. But with some forethought, and again, remember, teenagers are not good at planning. So by having an adult, they may be able to kind of create a plan for what they'd like to do or be in the future. Something as simple as when I get out of high school, I'm going to go, I've got some on-the-job training that I can tap into, or I've got a VOTEC school for, becoming, working with computers or, plumbing, whatever it is. It doesn't need to be college at all. I'm a little concerned we probably emphasize college a little bit too much, but some of them actually will go to college. One of the kids that I worked with when I was doing the meditation, I have a sense that he's probably going to be going to college and actually doing working in social work, hopefully in a few years. He seemed to have a plan for his life. If their sense of self-worth is diminished, let them know that they, again, acknowledging the difficulties in their life, but they also have a great opportunity to change those feelings. Kind of the sense that I got from listening to some of the psychologists is, of course, we have to acknowledge and be empathetic to the tremendous difficulties that some of our kids have gone through, really amazingly difficult. But we also have to kind of try to turn them in a direction where they can they can help themselves. And that comes into the process of helping them think about planning their own future. We need to encourage them to minimize the use of any addictive substances, and that's just common sense for all of us. But now that we know that they can become more addicted than an adult using the same drug, it's actually more important. Encourage them to learn and to study things they are interested in, and it really can just be whatever. If they're interested in, the Amazon rainforest or carpentry, it doesn't matter what that is. It just matters that they study and learn, and their neural connections will be strengthened, and that'll be a great advantage for them. Kind of encouraging them to be their best future self. Again, I've read some work by the psychologist Jordan Peterson that they've done on this process of actually having teenage kids kind of plan their future. I've seen a few of these actually online. I know this happens for some of the kids in our school system, but I think having that one-on-one experience with an adult and actually allowing the child to kind of write out what they want to do, how are they, if they want to go to VOTEC school, well, how are you going to get the money for that? How are you going to be able to afford an apartment, your phone, and those types of things? Really help them with the planning process, because typically they are not good about thinking about the planning process. Mm-hmm. In terms of a relationship with the child, it's collaborate rather than control. I think all of us remember it when we were teenagers. I thought I actually knew what life was about and what was happening in life. And by the time I had my first child, I thought my mom and dad were geniuses. So you kind of learn that as you go in life. But kind of collaborating with them and helping them with ideas rather than kind of controlling it, to guide them rather than gift them. I've seen where adopted parents or people working with kids that have been through difficult times want to help the kids, and they want to do that by buying them a fancy gizmo or Nintendo game or Xbox, kind of those types of things. That's probably really not helpful in terms of gifting the child. Certainly their small things are okay, a small gift for their birthday or Christmas or things like that. Those are absolutely not a problem. But gifting can be dangerous in terms of suddenly the child sees you as someone that can get them all sorts of neat electronic devices rather than someone that they can have a real adult connection with. So one of the really great studies about the teenage brain is called the Denuded study. Interesting, this comes from New Zealand. I think they have a population of probably less than the state of New York, but they have done some absolutely beautiful research. They started the research, I believe, in 1974 with 1,000 babies at the time of their birth, and they have followed them from 1974 to 2020. They have an amazing, it's what we call the follow-up rate of those initial 1,000 people. They're following, I believe, between 90 and 95% of this group, and that's absolutely unheard of in terms of research over this time frame. But they collect an amazing amount of material, everything from are you married, divorced, what's happened in your life. We're going to take your blood work. We're going to see how you're doing. We're going to look at poverty to see how that has affected your life. All sorts of parameters, thousands of parameters. And they have actually won a couple of national and international awards So I've thrown this website if any of you would like to learn more about the study part of it. For those of you that are readers, they have a book, I think it's released in the last 24 months, but it's called The Origins of You. It's really, they've taken all of their data and kind of put it into a language that those of us that don't have backgrounds in neuroscience or psychology to help us understand our transition from life. And the portion of the book from birth to 25 would be most interesting to us. But unfortunately, the book is a bit expensive. So what I did was I tried to find if I could, the main researcher in this, and he has actually online, and he has done several lectures. Richie, and my apologies, I forgot to put his last name here. But it's if you look up the Denuded Study 2016 lecture, he provides really the best scientific kind of data on what it's like to be an adolescent, what they're finding in their studies. I have found this group to be the best scientific research to really thinking about how to deal with adolescents. So I have included that, and I hope that will be useful to you. So now I'm ready for some questions. So please feel free to unmute and ask your question.
This is Vera. I just wanted to say thank you. This was really very interesting, and I'd heard a lot of this before, but your presentation was excellent, and I thought it was very kept me listening and interested.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Once we get through all this kind of COVID stuff, it would be fun for me to sit down with many of you and just listen to your experiences and how you interact with teenagers and kind of the sharing of minds, so to speak, getting your thoughts and suggestions. My experience, again, has been 3 years, and I know some of you have been doing this for years and years, so I'm hoping that might be something that we can do once we get through the COVID-19 issue. So thank you.
Hey, Don, it's Judy again. Let me ask you some questions about addictions being stronger in teens.
Okay.
Does that apparently lets up as they get older? Are there any physical signs of that? I don't know what to call it, susceptibility getting weaker? And if they get addicted to something in their teens, is it harder to get over it? Are they always going to be susceptible to it? Is there something in the brain that breaks down that makes them, like when they get to be 25, they fall into that trap again, and it happens again when they're 35 and when they're 55 because they were once struggled with it when they were a teenager? And maybe those are questions you don't have any idea about, but.
So that's a little bit outside of the scope of what I researched. I can tell you that obviously our brain has an addictive quality to it. It is definitely worse from the in the adolescent time frame. So it's probably going to take more effort to get those kids off of it. And again, that's my best guess at this point in time. But we will always struggle with addiction. It doesn't matter, let's say you're an adult that's 40 years old, you can have an addiction to money, power, cheesecake, cigarettes, our brains definitely have an addictive quality. The magic behind what makes the difference is kind of what I talked about in the adolescent brain, is where the frontal lobe is talking to the emotional part. It's kind of like it gives like a braking mechanism. It gives them more self-control of like, I think I'm not going to do that cocaine. I don't want to get addicted to it. Or if they're, it also kind of gives them the ability to pause for a moment. If somebody says something to them, that they don't like, if they're in a high school class or something, that they can pause and not respond angrily or get in a fight. So that's my best guess from what I've read on that question. But again, all of us have addictions that we have to deal with. But as adults, it's easier for us because we have the ability to pause, and we have the ability to kind of question ourselves, and we have better self-control, hopefully. So thank you. Any other questions? So even though I don't have kids at home anymore, my grandkids are not in the adolescence. I do have a dog that's in the adolescence. He seems to be perfect example of adolescence. He acts on impulse. He misreads what we're trying to share with him. He gets into accidents. He just got in one 2 weeks ago, and unfortunately it involved me. He wrapped his leash around my legs and pulled me over. He does get involved in fights. He never starts the fight, but he seems to be a magnet for other dogs for some reason. And I'm thinking if I let him, he would engage in dangerous or risky behavior. So please know that even though our talk today is about human being adolescence, that also kind of goes for basically all mammals, kind of goes through the same process also. So, and with that, thank you.